So Shelby, perfect. All right, hello and welcome to our Zoom education session on driving and dementia. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. My name is Chris Van Leuven, and with me today is Shelby Berry, and we're part of the education team here at the Alzheimer's Society of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. As you already know, dementia causes many changes in the brain, which can affect a person's abilities. And over time, dementia may cause changes that affect a person's ability to safely drive a motor vehicle. It's important to recognize that a dementia diagnosis does not automatically mean that a person is incapable of driving. Some people can be capable of driving safely for some time after their diagnosis, depending on the timing of the diagnosis and how quickly their dementia progresses. In today's session, we're going to explore ways to continue to drive safely, some of the warning signs that it might be time to stop driving, and tips for transitioning to a life without driving. We recognize that throughout our discussion today, there might be several questions that come up. And just in the interest of time, we'd like to ask you to please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You can feel free to jot down a question or post a question in the chat box so that you don't forget to ask it at the end. And we'll go through any questions that pop up in the chat at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for your help with this. Let's take a look at the topics that we plan to discuss with you in our session today. So the first is, how does dementia affect driving? How do the changes in the brain impact a person's ability to drive safely? And what are some of the things that we should be looking for that could be signs of unsafe driving? Next, we're going to talk about the responsibilities of healthcare providers, driving, and the law. We're going to be assessing the risks that are involved with driving when a person has dementia and looking at some considerations for having a conversation about driving retirement. Then we're going to talk about some strategies for supporting a retiring driver, the various alternatives to driving that are helpful to explore, and then we'll have some time for just a wrap up at conclusion and some questions. So let's dive into some myths, some of the biggest myths that exist about senior drivers and why these are important to our discussion today. We will explore some of these myths together and look at the realities for each of them. Myth number one, for senior drivers, rural driving is safer than urban driving. It's always something that tends to come up. I can be on a backcountry road and I feel a little bit more safe than I would in several lines of traffic. And the second is higher crash rates of senior drivers are the result of changes associated with aging. Well, what do you think? And third, seniors know when to stop driving, and decisions to stop driving should really be left to the individual. Well, let's talk about these three myths. Well, for senior drivers, rural driving is safer than urban driving. The answer here is false. It might seem that driving on rural roads is a lot safer for senior drivers, but that's not actually the case. In fact, in Canada, 2/3 of driver fatalities as a result of motor vehicle crashes do occur in rural areas, with injuries being a lot more common in urban areas. And number two, what about those higher crash rates of senior drivers being a result of changes associated with aging? That's false as well. The changes that happen in normal aging are not responsible for the increased likelihood that seniors will be involved in a collision. Rather, health conditions like diabetes, where the person might have reduced feeling in their feet, are more likely to be the culprit. And what about that third one? Seniors know when it's time to stop driving and they can decide for themselves. Well, that's also false. Cognitive impairments can impact judgment and impede a person from recognizing those changes that have occurred in their abilities. All right, we still have a couple more myths to go over. Myth number 4, having a co-pilot in the car is an acceptable method for maintaining the mobility of cognitively impaired seniors. And myth number 5, spouses and family members are good judges of driving abilities. Well, when it comes to number 4, that answer is false as well. So there's no evidence, there's no data to support the fact that having a co-pilot enhances a person's ability to drive safely when it comes to someone with dementia or a cognitive impairment. So that co-pilot isn't helpful. And number 5, my spouse, my husband can tell me if my driving abilities have changed. Well, that's also false. People with difficulty thinking, sometimes people have difficulty thinking about this topic objectively. And that is especially true when aspects of their life might be affected. So if your spouse is the primary driver in the household, they're the ones that are most likely to get you from point A to point B. It's really hard to think about the impact that the loss of their license might have on the family, the household as a whole. So the truth is that, all of these myths that we just went through, they're all false. And you can find further information about dispelling myths on the web at a website that's www.ualberta.ca. And they talk about medically at-risk drivers. So that would be somewhere to look up some more information. Driving requires several skills that are important for the safety of the driver, but also for other motorists, cyclists, and pedestrians as well. When we think about some of the skills that are necessary for safe driving, we can look to that following list. Quick reactions. We might need to react quickly in order to adapt to changing road conditions, if it starts snowing or gets icy. The driving errors of other motorists, like when they make an unsignaled lane change, pedestrians, if a pedestrian were to step out into the road, and so many other examples. Divided attention. It requires our ability to divide attention when we're driving. So we need to be able to watch a traffic light and still monitor the pedestrians that are milling about while also keeping our foot on the brake. We need to have good judgment in order to drive well. We need to be able to decide, at what point should I make that turn? Or at what point is it too late to go through that light? The understanding and ability to recall the rules of the road. So, for many of us, when we took that driver's test or when we took driver's ed, that was quite a while ago, but we need to be able to keep up on what the rules of the road are and stay on top of those regulations. The ability to find a desired destination. So, we need to be confident in using a map or using our GPS device or using that app on our phone. And lastly, adequate eyesight and hearing so that we can drive as safely as possible. For many individuals, driving provides access to the community where they can engage in everyday activities and occupations like shopping for groceries, getting a haircut, attending church, or meeting friends for coffee. Driving also represents, freedom, independence, and mobility. And although, when we really think about it, driving is a privilege, some people do view it as a right. Most people in the early stages of dementia can continue to drive safely and competently. However, because of the progressive nature of dementia, it's really critical to be aware of any changes that are happening in terms of the person's driving patterns. Now that we've had a chance to talk about the skills that are required when driving, let's explore the impact that dementia can have on our ability to drive. It's important to emphasize here that a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that a person cannot drive. However, at some point in time, the effects of dementia will make it unsafe to drive. So let's take a look at some of the changes that might affect a person's ability to drive safely. The first is memory. So as a result of changes in the brain that a person with dementia experiences, the person might have difficulty remembering things like the rules of the road, and they might also have trouble recognizing familiar places because of those memory challenges. Decision making. The person might find it more challenging or more difficult to make those decisions that might be required when driving. Sometimes it's a quick decision. Sometimes we need to pull over quickly for emergency vehicles. Sometimes, we have to be on our toes when we're driving. And attention. The person might have difficulty doing more than one thing at a time, or they might become easily distracted and not pay proper attention to their driving. Processing time and reaction time. The person's judgment time might be slowed, the reaction time might be slowed as a result of that slower information processing in the brain due to dementia. Judgment. Due to changes in insight and self-awareness in the brain, the person might not recognize when they can no longer do tasks safely. And impulsiveness. The person might act quickly without always thinking about their actions and the potential outcome of those actions. Many of the effects on driving that we've just shared are a result of the brain changes because of changes due to dementia. It may help to take a closer look at what's going on in the brain when a person has dementia so that we can increase our understanding of how their abilities are effective. So changes in executive functions like judgment and planning, those usually happen in our frontal lobe. And they can happen in the frontal lobe fairly early on in the dementia process. When the frontal lobe of the brain starts to change, we can see a person's judgment, reasoning, and planning abilities become compromised over time. Consider how this might impact a person with dementia's ability to plan out their route to a desired destination, or how their judgment may impact their decision-making abilities when driving. Next, let's talk about changes in visual and spatial ability. And those functions are controlled in our parietal and occipital lobes. When the parietal and occipital lobes of the brain are affected by dementia, there are changes in the person's visual abilities, depth perception, color perception, and peripheral vision, which can often result in that tunnel vision. The brain changes can also impact their spatial ability, which can really have a significant impact on a person's ability to drive safely. Consider how a person with dementia may react when driving on a busy highway in 2 or 3 lanes of traffic, or parking in a space between 2 vehicles when spatial ability and peripheral vision are affected. 3, memory changes and disorientation. These are functions that are controlled within our temporal and parietal lobes. And when the temporal and parietal lobes of the brain are affected by dementia, we see changes in the person's short-term, visual, and verbal memory, as well as the impact of disorientation, which can cause confusion about time and space, and can lead the person to forget where they are, where they're going, and how to get there. If you've been driving for many years, driving might feel automatic to you. However, as the dementia progresses, it will change the person's abilities, including their level of concentration, judgment, orientation, perception, and physical ability, which are all important and necessary skills for driving. As a result, regardless of the person's driving skill and experience before they started having symptoms, dementia will eventually put the person at a higher risk of some unsafe driving behaviors. A common question that we get asked is, how can we tell when a person might be unsafe to drive? And it's important to recognize that each person with dementia is unique, and how the disease will impact their brain may widely differ. But there are some signs that we can look for that might indicate that the person's driving is becoming unsafe. So forgetting how to locate familiar places. For example, forgetting how to get to the grocery store or to the bank that they've been attending for several years. Or even forgetting how to get home from where they are. That might be a warning sign to watch for. Slow response times. The person's reaction time might be slower, and it might take them longer to respond to a situation at hand. They may also make unsafe or poor decisions while driving. So maybe they're making a lane change without checking their blind spot or without signaling. Driving at the wrong speed, either too fast or too slow. So perhaps they are failing to observe the speed limits, or maybe they're driving too fast for the road conditions, or they're driving too slow and they're causing backups in traffic. Failing to observe traffic signs and signals. It might appear as though they haven't even seen that traffic sign or that signal. For example, they might drive past signs for pedestrian crossings, or they might drive through a stop sign or through a red light. Traffic violations, if we're finding that they're, never had a speeding ticket in their life and all of a sudden they're racking up speeding tickets, that could be an indicator that they're not driving safely. Becoming angry or confused while driving. So they may be frustrated, short-tempered, or confused about the traffic, other motorists, or how to get to their destination. Last on this list is hitting curbs. So this might indicate that their spatial abilities are changing and they can't tell where the curbs are located. Next, we have poor lane control, so drifting between lanes or making unsafe lane changes. Having difficulty merging with traffic. So for example, they may not notice a yield sign when they're merging onto the highway. Confusing the brake and the gas pedals, hitting the wrong one. Making errors at intersections. So maybe they're not obeying stop signs or traffic signals. Maybe they're not yielding the right of way correctly, or they're pulling out in front of other motorists. Making left-hand turns in the face of oncoming traffic or with pedestrians crossing. So they're making those left-hand turns when it's really not safe to do so. Or returning from a routine drive later than usual. So maybe that's an indicator that they've been driving around trying to determine how to get home. So if you've lost track, it seems like maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they hadn't, they just weren't able to get home. These behaviors can increase the person's risk of a collision, which can cause serious injury and death for themselves or potentially other people. I'm going to pass things over to Shelby now.
Great, thanks, Chris. So as Chris shared earlier, a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that you are not safe to drive. While your symptoms of dementia are mild, you can take steps to help you drive safely and independently as long as possible. So here are some great tips to consider to manage your driving ability. So first, settle into a consistent routine. So stick to the same route when you drive from place to place. Figure out when you most need to drive and follow that plan. So for example, do you drive to medical appointments, to shop, to meet with friends? And also consider other times when someone else can drive and maybe kind of trade off like that. Driving with someone that can assess your driving abilities on an ongoing basis can also be really helpful as well. They can notice if there are any changes in your driving abilities and can spot any of those risky behaviors that Chris just mentioned that you may not be aware of. Also consider using technology to support your capacity to drive. So if you're driving by yourself, you could use assistive technologies like a GPS to help you map out the route to your destination. And often that GPS will kind of tell you those directions, when to turn and how to get there. Above all, living well with dementia has been shown to slow the progression of dementia. So, when we're not in the car, the things that we're doing to stay well with dementia is also really important. So this can include adapting healthy brain and lifestyle choices, like challenging your brain, following a good diet, and staying physically and socially active. Will help you stay in that early stage of dementia for as long as possible. So adapting that healthy lifestyle is really important as well. So here's some other helpful strategies for the person living with dementia to consider so that they can make sure that they're driving safely. So first, you could complete a self-assessment of your driving, such as the CAA Simple Driving Assessment, which is available online, and we can plop that into the chat a bit later on. You could also consider taking a driver refresher course through a local driving school. Get an objective driving evaluation that will help you effectively assess if you have the skills to drive safely. Or also consider consulting a driver rehabilitation specialist in your area. So a driver rehabilitation specialist is an occupational therapist that has received specialized education in assessing a person's ability to drive. They apply knowledge of a person's medical conditions with implications to driving, and they can assess the cognitive, visual, perceptual, behavioral, and physical limitations that may impact a person's driving performance. And then another suggestion on here is to have a trusted care partner complete the fitness to drive screening measure, which you can see the website there. And again, we'll put those into the chat as well so that you can look at those as well. So those are some other things that we can do, some resources that might be helpful. And then here we have some more suggestions about how we can make sure that we're driving safely. So take short drives and again, keep to familiar roads. So that familiarity, that routine can be helpful. Drive at quieter times of day. So trying to avoid those rush hour times in the morning and the afternoon when everyone's, heading to work and school. Be aware of the timing of medications that may affect the ability to think clearly or to see. So what effects your medications have on you. Park at the end of a row to find your car easier, or take a picture of where you parked. So those are some suggestions in the busy parking lot, where we might be able to find or if we're trying to find our car afterwards. And also plan ahead. So know that brain changes will affect your ability to drive at some point in time, since dementia is progressive. And so being prepared for that is also important as well. So as we briefly shared a few minutes ago, when driving becomes a concern, it is helpful to look into the availability of a driving assessment. So for example, if you decide to consult with a driver rehabilitation specialist, the process could include a road test conducted by someone with experience in assessing drivers with cognitive issues. If an on-road driving assessment is not available to you, enlist the help of a doctor, either your primary care physician or a specialist, to determine if and when the person should stop driving, and to be connected to available support and resources. The healthcare provider may ask the person living with dementia and a family member about various things, such as their driving patterns. So when and where the person drives the most. Any differences that have been noticed in their driving skills. Any unsafe or abnormal driving behavior. Traffic tickets. So Chris talked about this earlier. So for going too fast or too slow or related to improper turns or failing to stop at a stop sign, for example. Any crashes or fender benders or near misses. Any instances where the person has become lost or, as Chris mentioned, has maybe taken a longer time to return home than usual. And how comfortable they feel and their family members feel about the person's driving abilities. So the things that Chris talked about earlier, may be some of the things that the doctor's asking about and looking for as well. So let's take some time to look at the legal obligations of healthcare providers when it comes to driving and dementia. First, we should clarify at the very start that doctors are not the ones who ultimately determine if you are fit to drive. So let's take a look at this. So in Ontario, doctors and nurse practitioners are required by law to report potentially unsafe drivers to the Ministry of Transportation due to a variety of issues, such as high-risk medical conditions, vision conditions, and functional impairments. So these things that may influence their ability to ultimately drive safely. This includes cognitive decline due to the progression of dementia. So Ontario doctors forward their medical opinion to the Ministry of Transportation in a standardized document called a medical condition report. In this report, there is a category that describes cognitive impairment that doctors are required to review. And in that document, they must identify if the person has a disorder resulting in cognitive impairment that affects attention, judgment, problem solving, planning and sequencing, memory, insight, reaction time or visual spatial perception, and results in substantial limitation of the person's ability to perform activities of daily living due to dementia. So the Ministry of Transportation then reviews the information on the medical condition report and then determines if the person should continue driving. So based on the information and the opinion provided by the doctor or the nurse practitioner, the Ministry of Transportation may suspend the person's license. So they make that decision based on the doctor's information. Again, it is important to acknowledge and understand that doctors are bound by law in most provinces and by professional ethics to report medical conditions that could be a serious risk to road safety. They also may be held liable if a person in their care who has dementia is involved in a motor vehicle collision and they have not reported the person's medical condition to provincial licensing authorities. So on the next slide, we will look at some considerations that a healthcare provider must address in providing their medical opinion about whether a person is safe to continue driving or is no longer safe to continue driving. So if the doctor determines that the person is unsafe to drive, They will confirm the diagnosis of dementia and address any conditions that could be aggravating that situation, such as another medical condition or a medical side effect. The doctor will ask the person to stop driving and may provide a written record to the person to help them remember that. This will be documented in the person's medical record as well, and the Ministry of Transportation will also be notified. And they're the ones, as we talked about, who make the final decision about whether the license will be suspended. If the doctor isn't sure if the person should still be driving, there are two potential pathways. So if driving safety is the only issue to assess, the doctor may refer the person to a health professional-led comprehensive on and off-road driving evaluation. So there is a cost associated with these tests, often several $100s, and they are not usually covered by OHIP or by private insurance, so it's often out of pocket. If the doctor thinks that there are additional health and safety concerns requiring further assessment and treatment, so concerns in addition to dementia, other health concerns, the doctor may refer the person to a local multidisciplinary dementia assessment site, which can include kind of a team of healthcare professionals such as geriatrician, an occupational therapist, for further assessment based on the complexities of their health. If the doctor determines that the person still appears safe to drive, they will request a follow-up approximately every 6 to 12 months to reevaluate and to check in and see how things are going there. So you might also be wondering about how a diagnosis of dementia impacts the person with dementia's car insurance. So a diagnosis of dementia does not mean automatic denial of insurance. If you have been diagnosed with dementia, talk to your doctor about the progression of your dementia and your driving abilities, and consider contacting your car insurance provider to share the information received from your doctor. Your provider will determine your car insurance coverage based on your specific situation. And it's important to also note that a failure to disclose a diagnosis could impact your insurance policy as well. So keeping that in mind is important. To Kristen, she's going to take a look at knowing when it's time to stop driving.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby. So when your abilities have changed to the point that a risk of a collision becomes more likely, then it's really no longer safe for you to continue driving, and you should stop driving as soon as possible. But when do you know that it's time to stop? And that can be difficult for anyone to assess their own abilities in kind of a neutral way. That's why it can help to ask someone that you know and trust to give you their honest and forthright opinion. It could be your spouse, it could be a good friend or your family doctor. Alternatively, it may be easier to hear an objective assessment from someone you don't know, like a driver rehabilitation specialist, like Shelby was sharing. So we have an Alzheimer's Society brochure, and it's available on our website, and it's called Conversations About Dementia and Driving. And in this brochure, there is a questionnaire to help assess driving ability. And by getting someone that you trust to fill out this questionnaire, you can get more insight into where your driving ability stands. However, it helps to be kind of prepared to read an assessment that you might not agree with. You may hear some information back that it might be difficult to accept or hear. Whenever it happens, that decision to stop driving won't be an easy one, and neither will be the conversation that leads to that decision. After all, the person with dementia is losing the privilege to drive due to changes in their abilities that they can't stop. And because of this, it's totally normal for them and for their family members and caregivers to feel angry, to feel sad, to feel frustrated, or maybe even experience feelings of hopelessness. As well, it may add strain to the relationship between the person living with dementia and their friends and family, particularly that primary caregiver. The primary caregiver will likely notice changes in the person's abilities before the person with dementia does. And they might be the first ones to discuss whether the person should stop driving. On the other hand, they might be hesitant to bring up the conversation about the person's driving ability, whether it's out of desire to see the person with dementia to continue to live independently, or maybe they're hesitant because they want to avoid conflict in the relationship. Although losing the privilege of driving can be difficult, it's important to remember that it can be equally, if not more, devastating to be involved in a motor vehicle collision. A collision can result in serious disability, or even in death for the person living with dementia, or in trauma or death of others involved in the collision. On the next slide, there's some important questions to consider when having a respectful conversation about driving retirement and how to weigh the risk that might be involved. When it comes to driving safely, we need to consider how we assess the risk involved in driving a vehicle. As we shared earlier, decision-making ability can be affected by dementia, so it's always helpful to talk to others who are close to you to get their opinions and their perspectives. Having a conversation about driving can be difficult, and it can be an emotional conversation. Here are some of the questions that you may wish to consider and discuss when having an honest and respectful conversation about driving. Number one, what are the benefits of driving? In other words, what advantages are when it comes to this person continuing to drive? Number two, what are the risks associated with driving? Are there risks to the person's safety? Are there risks to the person's well-being? Number three, who else might be affected by the person's driving? So, who else on the road might be affected? Number four, is the risk of driving worth it? And number five, if yes, how can we lower the risk? What can we do to reduce that risk, knowing that we can never completely eliminate the risk involved? As we shared earlier, both the conversation around and the decision to stop driving isn't going to be easy. There might be several concerns that come up for the person with dementia, as well as care partners and family members when we're considering that retirement from driving. Let's look at those emotional concerns first. So, coping with the loss of autonomy and independence. A person may have been driving for most of their adult life, and stopping driving can feel like losing their autonomy and their independence. They might now have to look to others to help with driving. Loss of independence can bring about feelings of sadness, grief, anger, and frustration. It can also impact the person's self-esteem, and it can affect their confidence level as well. Coping with the loss of an important role or identity. Once again, the person might have been driving for most of their adult life, and being able to drive has given them an important role and sense of identity. Perhaps they're the main driver in the family or relationship, and others have had to rely on them to get to places, appointments, and to run errands. Stopping driving means that that important role and that important piece of their identity have been taken away. Let's now look at some of the practical concerns around retirement from driving. When helping the person plan ahead for a time when they must stop driving, several questions might come up about how to get around when driving is no longer an option. And it can be useful to consider these questions. What alternative transportation options exist? So what's available in your area? And it's important to note that availability for transportation options can vary depending on whether or not the person lives rurally or if they live in an urban setting. We'll talk more about alternatives to driving in a few minutes. It's also a good idea for the person to use these alternative forms of transportation while it's still safe for the person to drive. So this will help them get used to new routines that they will transition to after they've hung up their car keys for good. As well, it might help them to accept the difficult decision to stop driving when it eventually comes. You know, if we're already used to using public transportation, if we're already used to calling a taxi, then it becomes easier to start to rely on those things in a transitionary period, and start to incorporate them into our schedule over a period of time. The next question, how do I access alternative transportation options? And this, again, might vary depending on the person's living situation and the transportation options available in their community. But if you are looking for some of those options, your local community care option, our office is a good place to start. So community care does offer some driving options with volunteer drivers. So definitely a place to start. And next, how much will it cost? Cost for alternative transportation options is something that should be considered as well. And will those options involve accessing community transportation services like community care, or opting for a taxi or an Uber or using public transit? The cost might vary depending on the type of service and the location from the destination. So there again, you know, if we're living rurally, we might have to consider that it could be a higher cost.
Okay, so now that we've taken some time to acknowledge and better understand the concerns that may come up when a person retires from driving, let's take a look at how we can effectively support a retiring driver. So first, it's important to acknowledge how difficult it may be for the person to stop driving. So if we can put ourselves in the person's shoes, we may develop a better understanding of the emotions and challenges that they may be experiencing. And validating how difficult it is for the person to give up driving helps to reassure them that we understand, because driving is so linked to independence, it can be a big change for that person. If the doctor has asked the person to stop driving, it can be helpful to respond with the same short message that the doctor believes it is safer not to drive. And consistent messaging can really be important here. And because of dementia, and, you know, the memory changes with dementia, this message may need to be shared more than once. We can also support a retiring driver by suggesting some alternatives to driving and assisting with planning and the coordination of these resources whenever possible. So for example, help the person to arrange a taxi to the grocery store, you know, once a month, or set up an account with a taxi firm and order taxis in advance. These might be some ways that we can support them with those alternatives. We could also look into companies that offer home delivery services that would help to meet the person's needs. So for example, exploring any pharmacy or grocery home delivery services that might be available in the area could be another suggestion. And we also can encourage the person to take charge of their new transportation arrangements so they can maintain their independence and decision making as well. You know, if this is something that's important to them in making these arrangements themselves. So for example, getting details and timetables of local transportation services or opening and managing their own taxi account might be important to them. We can also talk about and acknowledge some of the benefits that may come with not driving, and kind of emphasize maybe some of the positive aspects of driving retirement. So this might include highlighting the benefits of saving money on the cost of running and maintaining a car. Just in general being less stressful, like maybe the person was starting to feel a bit stressed about their driving. Or being able to enjoy, you know, the scenery as a passenger as well. These might be some of the positive aspects of not driving that we could consider. We can also look at arranging outings that do not require a car. So for example, arrange to take a walk around the block or to go to a nearby grocery store to pick up a few items instead. A letter from the doctor or licensing authority may help to accept the decision. So kind of having that in writing, sometimes that helps people to better understand and revisit that decision that was made. So that tangible document to remind the person that they can no longer drive might be a resource that's helpful to you. And also consult with community resources to access other transportation options, as Chris mentioned a couple of them there. So when a person is retiring from driving, it's always helpful to look at alternatives to driving. So here are a few to consider. So you could consider asking a family member, a friend, or a neighbor for a ride. If you are part of, you know, a social or community group or a religious community, ask if there is anyone that could pick you up and drive you there, or, you know, perhaps when they go and do groceries, you could join along too. Use public transit if it is nearby and available to you, or order a taxi when you need to go where you are going, are some other alternatives. And here we have some other alternatives to consider as well. So take advantage of volunteer driving services. So for example, a service that's often available in our areas is through Community Care and their volunteer driving service. You could consider using a ride sharing app like Uber or Lyft. And as you mentioned before, perhaps walk instead of driving, especially if the weather's nice and, you know, maybe it's somewhere close by that you're going to, like the mailbox or the local store. So it's always a great way to stay physically active, to get outdoors and to get some fresh air as well. So once again, it's important to remember that a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that you cannot drive. It is, however, just as important to know that at some point in time, the effects of dementia will make it unsafe to drive. So that element of planning ahead and being aware of that is important as well. So the key is to start the conversation early, and hopefully today's presentation has helped, and also recognize that the Alzheimer's Society is happy to support you with that. If you have any questions or require further assistance, you know, we encourage you to connect with us and with your client support coordinator to talk about that as well.
Yeah, so to learn more about any of the topics that we've discussed today, please tap into our website at www.alzheimer.ca/PKLNH. There's a special section on the website dedicated to the topic of driving and dementia, which contains a lot of helpful resources, such as that one brochure that I mentioned, Conversations About Dementia and Driving, and you can see images from it on the screen. And we also encourage you to reach out and talk to your client support coordinator, or you can talk to Shelby and I as education coordinators about other resources that are available to you. And here, I just wanted to chat a little bit about a new resource that has come about. And I think we were just kind of introduced to it last fall, and it's the Driving and Dementia Roadmap. And it's a free online Canadian resource that's developed to empower older adults living with dementia to make informed decisions about when to stop driving, and to help support them through that driving cessation process. And this website was developed by researchers from Baycrest, Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, and the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging. Information contained within the Driving and Dementia Roadmap is tailored to 3 groups. So older adults who are diagnosed with dementia, family and friend carers of somebody living with dementia, along with healthcare professionals. And this resource covers important topics like understanding how dementia affects driving, recognizing when it might be time to stop driving, having productive conversations about stopping to drive, and dealing with the emotional impact of not driving, getting around without driving. So a little bit of an expansion on what we were just talking about, and learning about licensing and reporting. And this roadmap is available at www.drivinganddementia.ca, and it includes resources from every province and territory. So you'll find information that's relevant for us who are living here in Ontario there. Living with and supporting someone with dementia is not easy, and we want you to know that you're not alone, and the Alzheimer's Society is here to help. We have a wide range of supportive services that are designed to assist you in this journey. And on the slide there, you can see our intake coordinator, Maddie. She's your first point of contact with the Alzheimer's Society, and she can connect you with the right person and the right resources to meet your needs. So her contact information is there. If you're not yet a client here with us at the Alzheimer's Society, you can reach out to Maddie and she will get you started in that process of becoming a client. So I think we're going to stop the recording now so we can take some questions if anyone has any.